Every time you announce a goal before you have worked for it, every time you share a plan before you have executed it, every time you tell someone what you're going to do instead of simply doing it, you're draining the exact energy you need to make it happen. And most people do this every single day without realizing it, without understanding the cost, without seeing the connection between the words they speak and the results that never seem to arrive. They post about the gym before their body changes. They announce the business before they have made a single sale. They talk about the book they're going to write, the life they're going to build, the person they're going to become, and then they wonder why, despite all the intention and all the enthusiasm and all the public declarations of what they're going to do, nothing ever seems to move. James Allen understood why. He wrote that the man who does not control his thoughts controls nothing. And what he meant was not just the obvious thoughts, the ones you are aware of, but the invisible habits of mind that operate below the surface, the need for validation before you have earned it, the hunger for recognition before you have built anything worth recognizing, the compulsion to be seen that steals the energy you need to become someone worth seeing. In a world that rewards the loudest voice, that celebrates the most visible presence, that measures worth in likes and views and public declarations of progress, James Allen was pointing at something that most people never figure out until it is too late. The ones who actually build something, the ones who actually arrive, the ones who actually become who they were capable of becoming, they're almost never the loudest ones in the room. They're the quiet ones, the ones who said nothing and did everything, the ones who protected their process from the noise of other people's opinions, who moved without announcing their movements, who built without showing their blueprints, who planted seeds in silence and let the harvest speak for itself. That is what this video is about. Not motivation, not inspiration, not the kind of content that makes you feel good for an hour and then disappears when the feeling fades. This is about a way of operating, a set of principles that James Allen spent his entire life writing about. Principles that have outlasted him by more than a century, because the truth at the center of them does not change, does not go out of style, does not become less relevant as the world gets louder around it. 5 principles that separate the people who talk about their lives from the people who build them. And the first one is the one that most people misunderstand completely. Silence is not weakness. Silence is strategy. Most people hear the word silence and think of someone who is hiding, someone who is passive, someone who lacks the confidence to speak, someone who has nothing to say. But that is not the silence James Allen was writing about. The silence he understood was not the silence of someone who has nothing. It was the silence of someone who has everything to protect. The silence of the person who knows that the energy they spend explaining their process is energy stolen from the process itself. That the time they spend seeking validation is time taken from the work that would make validation irrelevant. That every word spoken about what they're going to do is a small leak in the reservoir of focus they need to actually do it. Think about the last time you told someone about a goal you had. Not after you achieved it, before, in the early stages, when the idea was still new and fragile and forming, when you were still figuring out what it was going to take. And think about how it felt to say it out loud, to see someone react, to feel the small rush of being seen, of being acknowledged, of having someone say, "That sounds incredible. I can't wait to see how it turns out." And then think about what happened next. For most people, something subtle but significant shifts in that moment because the brain, which cannot always distinguish between the feeling of doing something and the feeling of being recognized for it, registers a small dose of satisfaction, a small sense of completion, as if the announcement itself were an accomplishment. And that satisfaction, subtle as it is, takes the edge off the urgency. The fire that was driving you toward the goal flickers just a little because some part of you already got the reward, already felt the recognition, already experienced a version of the outcome. And now the work that remains feels slightly less urgent than it did before you said anything. James Allen wrote that the will to do springs from the knowledge that we can do, but what most people don't realize is that the will is a limited resource, and it leaks every time you spend on performance instead of production. There was a man named Henry. He had an idea for a business that genuinely excited him. Something real, something with market potential, something he had been thinking about for months and finally felt ready to pursue. The day he decided to move forward, he did what most people do. He told everyone. Friends, family, colleagues, anyone who would listen. He described the vision with the enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered something important, and the response was warm, encouraging, full of the kind of affirmation that felt like confirmation that he was on the right track. But something happened in the weeks that followed. The energy that had been pushing him toward the work began to dissipate. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, the way a fire goes out when nobody tends it. The conversations he had been having about the business started to feel like a substitute for the work of building it. The excitement in other people's eyes started to feel like a pressure he hadn't anticipated, and the goal that had felt urgent and alive before he said anything about it started to feel somehow heavier, somehow more complicated, somehow less his own. Henry didn't understand what had happened until much later, when he read something James Allen had written about the nature of thought and energy, that what a man conceives and keeps secret in his mind, he strengthens, and what he disperses through unnecessary speech, he weakens. He had dispersed it, and the lesson he carried from that experience was one that changed everything that came after. Move in silence, not because secrecy is a virtue in itself, but because the process of building something real is fragile in its early stages, and fragile things need protection, not exposure. The tree does not ask permission from the forest to grow. It simply sends its roots deeper into the ground, in silence, in darkness, in the invisible work that nobody sees, but that holds everything that comes later. Your goals are the same. They need roots before they need recognition. And roots grow in silence. So the next time you feel the urge to announce something before you have built it, ask yourself one question. Am I sharing this because it serves the goal or because it serves my need to be seen? If the answer is the second one, close your mouth and open your hands. Do the work. Let the silence protect what you are building. And trust that when it is ready, it will not need an announcement. It will simply arrive. The second principle is the one that everyone says they understand and almost nobody actually practices. Focus. Real focus. Not the kind you have for 20 minutes before you check your phone. Not the kind that lasts until something more interesting appears. Not the kind that gets applied to 5 different things simultaneously and therefore never transforms any of them. The kind of focus that closes doors. The kind that says no to things that are good so that it can say yes to the thing that is essential. The kind that chooses one direction and becomes absolutely lethal in it, regardless of what else appears, regardless of how attractive the alternatives look, regardless of how many other people are moving in other directions and seeming to succeed. James Allen wrote that the man who is master of himself is master of his world, and mastery, real mastery, the kind that produces results that cannot be ignored, does not come from doing many things adequately. It comes from doing one thing completely. Most people will never discover this, not because they lack the intelligence to understand it, but because the world they live in is specifically designed to prevent it. Every notification, every new platform, every new opportunity that appears on the periphery of their vision, every moment of excitement about something new, all of it is pulling them away from the depth that mastery requires, and toward the surface where everything is stimulating and nothing is transformed. Think about the people you know who seem to always be doing something new, always excited about the latest project, always starting something fresh just as the last thing is getting difficult. They are busy, genuinely busy, often working harder than the people who are actually building something. But they are not building anything. They are moving without going anywhere, expending energy without accumulating momentum, because momentum requires direction, and direction requires the willingness to say no to everything that is not the thing. James Allen understood this as a law, not a preference, not a suggestion, but a principle as consistent as gravity. He wrote that the strength of the effort is the measure of the result. And what he meant was not just physical effort, but concentrated effort, the kind that goes deep rather than wide, that penetrates rather than grazes, that transforms rather than merely touches. There was a woman named Margaret. She was talented in a way that everyone around her recognized. She could do many things well: write, design, speak, organize, teach. And for years, she applied that talent in many directions simultaneously, starting things, making progress, and then pivoting when the next interesting thing appeared. She was never short of ideas, never short of enthusiasm, never short of the initial energy that gets things started. But she was consistently short of results. Not because she lacked capability. She had more capability than most of the people around her who were achieving more. But because her capability was dispersed across too many directions to accumulate into anything that could not be ignored. One year, after a conversation that she described as the most uncomfortable thing anyone had ever said to her, a mentor told her that she was using her talent to avoid commitment, that every new project was an escape from the depth that the previous one required, that she was brilliant at starting and terrified of the sustained discomfort of staying. She sat with that for a long time, and then she made a decision that felt almost violent in its simplicity. One thing. For 1 year, she would do one thing, develop one skill, build one body of work, move in one direction, and say no to everything else, regardless of how good it looked, regardless of how excited it made her, regardless of what she might be missing. The first few months were genuinely uncomfortable. The pull of other possibilities was constant. The fear of missing something was loud. The sense that she was falling behind in the areas she had set aside felt real, even when it wasn't. But she stayed, and slowly, almost invisibly at first, something began to change. The work got deeper, the thinking got clearer, the results got more substantial, and the momentum that had always been dispersed across many directions began to accumulate in one. By the end of the year, she had built something that none of her previous projects had ever become, something solid, something that the market recognized, something that could not be ignored. Not because she had worked harder, she had actually done less in terms of volume, but because she had finally understood what James Allen had been writing about all along, that the difference between a life of scattered effort and a life of genuine achievement is not talent, not opportunity, not luck. It is the willingness to focus so completely on one thing that everything else becomes impossible to distract you. So let me ask you directly, what is your one thing? Not the 5 things you're currently spreading yourself across. Not the 3 things that are all important. Not the list of priorities that somehow all feel equally urgent. The one thing that if you gave it everything, if you closed every other door and walked through this one with absolute commitment, would change everything. Because that thing exists for you, and it is waiting for you to stop dividing yourself and start investing yourself completely. The third principle is the one that costs the most and produces the most. Execute without permission. Most people are waiting to feel ready, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone to tell them that their idea is good enough, that they are capable enough, that the conditions are finally favorable enough to justify beginning. And that wait, dressed up in the language of prudence and preparation and timing, is the most expensive thing most people will ever do with their life. Because the moment never comes, not the way they are waiting for it. The clarity they are hoping will arrive before they begin, the confidence they're expecting to feel before they move, the certainty they're seeking before they commit, none of those things come before the action. They come because of it. James Allen wrote that he who would accomplish little must sacrifice little. And what he meant was not sacrifice in the dramatic sense, not suffering, not punishment, but the sacrifice of comfort, of certainty, of the safe position of someone who has not yet tried and therefore cannot yet fail. That sacrifice is what execution requires. And most people are not willing to make it. Not because they are lazy, not because they don't care, not because the goal doesn't matter to them, but because beginning without permission, moving without certainty, building without guarantees, feels genuinely dangerous in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has never stood at that edge. There was a man named Arthur. He had spent 3 years preparing to start something, reading about it, researching it, planning it, talking to people who had done something similar, building a picture in his mind of exactly what it would look like when it was ready to begin. He had knowledge, genuine knowledge, more than most people who were already doing what he wanted to do. But he didn't have certainty, and he had decided somewhere along the way without ever consciously choosing it, that certainty was a prerequisite for action. One evening, his daughter, who was 9 years old and had no awareness of the significance of what she was asking, looked at him across the dinner table and said, "Dad, why don't you just start?" He didn't have an answer, not a real one. He had reasons, plenty of them, but when he tried to explain them to a 9-year-old who didn't understand why any of them were relevant, he heard them differently than he ever had before. They sounded like what they were: fear in disguise. The next morning he started. Not perfectly, not with everything in place, not with the certainty he had been waiting for, but he started. And what he discovered in the weeks and months that followed was something James Allen had written about with quiet precision. That action generates the clarity that waiting never provides. That movement, even imperfect movement, even uncertain movement, produces information that no amount of preparation can substitute for. That the world reveals itself to the person who is moving through it in ways it never reveals itself to the person who is standing still, waiting for it to be safe enough to begin. Arthur's business did not succeed immediately. It did not succeed perfectly. There were failures and adjustments and moments where the right decision was to go back and change something he had already built. But it succeeded, not despite the imperfection of how he began, but partly because of it, because beginning imperfectly gave him real information that improved everything that followed, information that 3 more years of planning could never have provided. James Allen wrote that the dreamers are the saviors of the world, but the dream that saves you is not the one you hold in your mind. It is the one you build with your hands. And building starts with one decision, made without waiting for permission, made without certainty, made in the full knowledge that you are not ready, and the full understanding that ready is not a condition that precedes action. It is a condition that action creates. So whatever you have been waiting to begin, whatever door you have been standing in front of telling yourself that someday, when the conditions are right, you will finally walk through, I want you to understand something clearly. The conditions are not going to get right. They're going to stay exactly as uncertain and imperfect and inconvenient as they are now. And the only thing that is going to change is how much time you have spent not beginning. So begin. Not tomorrow. Not when you feel ready. Not when someone gives you permission. Now, the fourth principle is the one that requires the most courage because it asks you to do something that goes against everything the culture around you is telling you to do. Protect your process from the opinion of people who are not living it. Everyone has an opinion about what you should do, how you should do it, whether it makes sense, whether you're ready, whether this is the right time, whether the idea is good enough, whether you have what it takes. And if you're not careful, if you are not defined firmly enough in your own direction, those opinions will reshape your path, not through force, not through any explicit instruction, but through the slow accumulation of doubt that other people's uncertainty plants in soil that was not yet firm enough to resist it. James Allen wrote that a man is what he thinks, and what he also understood was that what a man thinks is profoundly influenced by what he allows into his mind. And there is nothing that enters the mind more quickly or settles more deeply or does more damage to a process that is still forming than the opinion of someone who is not doing the work. Because everyone who is not doing the work has an opinion about how the work should be done. And their opinion comes not from knowledge, not from experience, not from any genuine understanding of what you're building, but from their own fears, their own limitations, their own unconscious belief about what is possible for someone like them, projected onto you as if it were advice. There was a woman named Eleanor. She had made a decision that she knew was right, One of those decisions that comes from a place so deep inside you that it doesn't require external validation. It just is. And she knew it was right the way you know certain things, not because you can fully explain them, but because every time you question them, the questioning feels false. She made the mistake of sharing the decision before she had executed it. And the responses she received from people who loved her, from people who meant well, from people who were genuinely trying to help, were enough to make her doubt something she had no real reason to doubt. Not because the doubts they raised were valid. In retrospect, none of them were, but because she had shared the decision before it was strong enough to withstand being questioned, before the roots were deep enough to hold against the wind. She delayed, reconsidered, modified, and eventually, a version of what she had originally decided to do, somewhat diminished, somewhat redirected by the opinions of people who were not going to live with the consequences, became what she actually did. And it worked reasonably well, enough to be considered a success by anyone looking from the outside. But she knew, in the quiet of her own understanding, that it was not what it could have been, that somewhere between her original clarity and the version that survived the opinions of everyone around her, something essential had been compromised. James Allen wrote that circumstances do not make the man, they reveal him. And what Eleanor's experience revealed was not a weakness in her decision, but a lesson about the timing of disclosure. Share the result, not the process. Protect what you are building until it is strong enough to withstand being questioned. And choose very carefully whose questions you allow to reach you. Not because you're arrogant, not because other perspectives have no value, but because the most important perspective in the early stages of anything worth building is your own. And your own perspective needs space and silence and protection from the noise of people who are not living your process to develop into something strong enough to actually guide you. So here is the practice. Before you share something, ask yourself this question. Is this strong enough to survive scrutiny? Or do I need more time in silence before I expose it to the world? And if the answer is more time, give it more time. The world will still be there when you're ready. And what you bring to it will be far more powerful for having been protected while it was forming. The fifth and final principle is the one that most people find hardest to endure because it asks you to be content with something the culture around you treats as failure. Invisibility. There is a stage in the development of anything worth building where nobody is watching, nobody is applauding, nobody is asking how it is going, where the results are not yet visible and the effort is entirely private, and the only evidence that anything is happening exists in the quiet of your own experience. That stage is not a detour on the way to success. That stage is where success is built. James Allen wrote about this with a clarity that few people have matched. He understood that the outer world is always a reflection of the inner one, and that the inner world can only be developed in the quiet, in the invisible work, in the sustained private effort that nobody sees, but that determines everything about what eventually becomes visible. Most people cannot endure this stage, not because they lack talent, not because their goal is wrong, not because the work they're doing is not valuable, but because they have been trained by a culture of instant visibility to believe that if nobody is watching, nothing is happening. And when nothing seems to be happening, they stop. They abandon the process not because it isn't working, but because they cannot see it working because there is no echo, no validation, no external confirmation that the effort they are putting in is actually leading somewhere. And so they stop. And everything they were building, which was working, which was slowly and invisibly becoming something real, disappears not because it failed, but because they could not endure the silence of its development. Think about a tree in its first years. From the outside, nothing seems to be happening. You would look at a young tree and see almost no change from one season to the next, almost no visible evidence of growth, almost nothing to suggest that something significant is occurring. But underground, in the dark and the silence, in the part of the process that nobody sees, the roots are going deeper, the foundation is getting stronger, the infrastructure that will eventually support everything that grows above the surface is being built with a thoroughness and a solidity that the visible parts of the tree will one day depend on completely. Your process is the same. The work you do in the invisible stage, the work that nobody applauds, the work that produces no echo, the work that happens in the private hours when nobody is watching and there's nothing to perform. That work is the roots. And the depth of those roots determines the height of everything that eventually grows from them. There was a man named Samuel. He had been working on something for 2 years, quietly, privately, with a consistency that nobody around him fully understood because nobody could see what it was producing. His friends assumed he was spinning his wheels, that the lack of visible results meant the effort was misaligned, that if it was really working, something would show by now. He heard their concern, and he felt the pull of it, the temptation to abandon the invisible work and do something that would produce quicker validation, something that would give him the echo he was not getting from the process he was in. But he remembered something he had read, something James Allen had written about the nature of the growth that lasts, that it is always slow in the beginning, that it always requires a period of invisible development, that the person who cannot endure that period will never reach the stage where the growth becomes undeniable. So he stayed. And at the end of the 3rd year, something that had been invisible for so long that even he had occasionally doubted whether anything was actually happening, became suddenly, powerfully, undeniably visible. Not because anything changed suddenly, but because the accumulation of 3 years of invisible work crossed a threshold, and what had been below the surface long enough to develop real roots finally broke through into the light. James Allen wrote that the vision that you glorify in your mind, the ideal that you enthrone in your heart, this you will build your life by. And what Samuel understood by the end of that 3rd year was that the vision had been building him long before anyone could see what it was building toward. That is the gift of invisibility, not the absence of progress, but the presence of a depth that visible progress, celebrated too early, before the roots are strong enough, before the foundation is solid enough, before the work has accumulated long enough to be truly unshakable, can never produce. So if you're in that stage right now, if you're doing the work and not seeing the results, if you're building and nobody is watching, if you're in the silence of the invisible years, and some part of you is wondering whether any of this is actually leading somewhere, I want to say something to you directly. You are not failing because nobody can see what you are doing. You are building. You are not stagnating because the results are not yet visible. You are developing. And the roots you're growing right now, in the silence, in the private hours, in the invisible work that nobody applauds, those roots are going to hold everything that comes after. Stay. Do the work. Protect the process. And trust that what is being built in silence will arrive with a force that no announcement could have prepared anyone for. Because the ones who actually change things, the ones who actually build lives that matter, the ones who actually become who they were capable of becoming, they almost never announced that they were coming. They were just here one day, having done the work in the silence for as long as it took. Invisible yesterday, impossible to ignore today. That is the power of silence. That is what James Allen understood. And now, so do you. If this video moved something in you, if something you heard today made you stop and think, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this and subscribe to the channel. There is so much more to explore together. See you in the next one.